This is James Lindsay, and
Go
you
ahead,
are
James.
watching the. This is James Lindsay, and you are watching the Break It Down show.
My wireless is so terrible. I'm gonna try to get closer to the house here. Yes, I'm Bayside over here, trying to get closer to the signal because I'm having trouble connecting. But everybody, we got James Lindsay, who's awesome on the show. I'm gonna let Will do some more talking than normal because my wireless stinks. So, Will, tell us why we're talking to James.
Yeah, well, James Lindsay's attracted a lot of attention. Some might say notoriety in academia and on the internet in recent years. A couple of 100,000 Twitter and social media followers. He's the guy that was partly responsible for what's sometimes called SoCal 2, where a group of young academics sent a bunch of bluntly bullshit papers into top journals to see if they'd get published. One was a direct transcription of Mein Kampf, if I have that correct, James, that was sent to a feminist studies journal. Another one looked at fat bodybuilding, the art of being in shape, even if you are 100 to 200 pounds overweight. One looked at rape and sexual violence culture in dog parks, claiming that dogs humping one another and sometimes humans' legs reflected the male dominant nature of our society. And this has drawn a lot of adulation from people that think that a great deal of critical scholarship is just nonsensical, and also some criticism, some back and forth. So both Pete and I wanted to talk to you, James, get your opinion on a couple of different things. But that is why James Lindsay is on the program. I'll also note that this guest was recently retweeted by President Donald Trump, who has gone forward with a series of executive orders, and I believe they'd be called executive statements, limiting the teaching of certain kinds of critical scholarship in the U.S. executive branch. So our man, Mr. Lindsay, or Dr. Lindsay, has drawn the attention of the current and probably outgoing president of the United States. So a guy worth talking to. James Lindsay's on the show. And Pete, it looks like you found a spot where wireless is working. So James, good to have you here.
Hey, great to be here. Thanks.
You wanna open with a question, Pete, or you want me to?
I can open with a question if you want. No, I'm just kidding. I don't have any questions. I am exhausted.
I'll try to throw a question at you here. So, like Will,
Okay.
When you take on this peer review challenge you guys did with writing these fictitious papers, what is the long-term effect? I mean, you've talked a lot about like what you guys wrote and everything, but does this make a difference academically? I mean, it takes forever to people to write things. You guys kind of game the system and put these things in there that kind of mock the system in general. Is that going to make a difference?
That's a hard question. At the time, I said that if it will make a difference, academia is a slow turning battleship. The wheels of the academic process grind slowly, and that's probably mostly for a good thing. Mostly a good thing for good reasons. I predicted at the time that if it's going to make any significant impact, we won't even see the beginnings of it for 2 years, which would be about now, and that it would be 10 years before anything significant within academia changed around it. Certainly, we have not seen a great deal of improvement, although we do see many more people who would be working in academia who are aware that something has gone off in certain sectors of both cultural studies, I guess, broadly construed, and even some of the social sciences. That's not just the replicability crisis or replication crisis that you see in psychology and sociology. So to the point of whether or not something will change, academic papers are starting to be written. There was one written recently that we've been aware of, I guess, a few months ago. Again, academia is a slow entity. That argued, in fact, that while they were not, that the author is a neuroscientist and he was not particularly keen on what we did, but at the same time, he made the argument that the papers that we wrote that do not involve falsified data or fabricated data, which we would agree with that, of course, that those papers that did not use that should be reinstated. They should not have been retracted from their journals, and the journals should have to stand by the arguments that we made that they thought were worthy, which means something in academia has started to move, as I kind of predicted in the 2-year timeline. As for what happens next, it's hard to say. We've had quite the moral panic shaping the direction of academia this summer. And what the fallout from that will be, I don't know. Moral panics don't last forever, and it's not clear what will happen when a lot of people wake up to realize they instituted a lot of illegal policies and got themselves in a lot of hot water over their actions over the summer this year. So I don't know what the long-term effects are. My hope is that the long-term effects will be that we start to see more cross-disciplinary criticism instead of so much siloing that allows this sort of thing to happen being taken seriously. We also see a realignment of the academic incentive structures, because right now, the reason that those papers were able to be accepted and the reason that the departments and journals and disciplines that accepted them exist at the degree that they do is because the incentives in the university don't exist to satisfy the knowledge production requirements of criticism of bad ideas while forwarding the best ideas we can in an effective way. And so until those incentives move, nothing else changes. So hopefully it will create incentives where or qualifies for tenure or something that can get you even an endowed chair if you are able to deflate pretentious bullshit that's injuring the academic enterprise. And so I don't know over the next 5 to 8 years, 10 years, what impact it will have. But if we don't lose sense of the world in the current situation, I think that it will have been a groundbreaking or watershed moment where something became more clear that something has to be done to clean up what's happening in various parts of academia.
Yeah, and just as a quick comment on that, I mean, I followed the SoCal 2 situation. I'm a quantitative political scientist. I didn't have any ethical problem with it really whatsoever. My impression was that the goal was to sort of call out some of these siloed sub-disciplines that we see in academia, from a lot of non-quant sociology on over into things, fat studies, women's studies, so on. So the point was, we're going to present complete nonsense that any highly intelligent person, especially an academic, should be able to vet through and understand to be nonsense. I mean, dogs don't have human sexual relationships. And if these papers are accepted in bulk, and they were almost all accepted, right? I mean,
7 out of 20 by the time that we were called out by the Wall Street Journal. And we had actually kind of done two things. So the first 6, I don't want to say they don't count like to pad our resume, but they don't count in the sense that they weren't the same thing. So we actually did something different with the first 6, all of which were just utterly rejected. And so in some sense, half of them by the time we got called out had been accepted, which is pretty significant. And a sociologist, I forget where, did an analysis based on the peer-reviewed comments and estimated that even just out of all of the 20, probably somewhere between 11 and 12 would have been accepted. In the
12
end.
out of 20 for a junior academic. I mean, that's quite respectable.
12 out of 20 with 6 of them being deliberately not even engaging with the literature. So that's why they don't, in some sense, count. Once we started engaging with the literature, we had an enormous success rate. So 12 out of 14 is really kind of what we would have been looking at.
And engaging with the literature, of course, you mean citing the proper figures in left-wing scholarship in your papers that are taken from Hitler or that are referring to dog sex. I mean, that's yeah. So I mean, and I will say I've read the OG, the original SoCal, who I noticed reviewed cynical theories. His paper is hilarious. The hermeneutics of quantum gravity. The whole point, and if you're a wonk as I am, as you probably are, I mean, it's pretty high IQ. It's an intelligent paper, but the whole point is that the rules of everything have to be permeable and postmodern. So let's start looking at gravity and whether fire is hot and so on down the line. And this was, again, published in probably a top 20 journal. So this to some extent is why I enjoy doing public intellectual work, like the Wall Street Journal or commentary or something generally won't let you get away with that kind of crap because they actually have to sell the product to millions of people. But fair enough. I guess leading off with a question and then going from this single incident, and as I suppose Pete, as usual, will take 2 questions. So the first one that I got a lot when I asked on Twitter, what are some things to ask you and to ask another gentleman named Chris Rufo? One of the basics from quote unquote normies on the site was just, is this an issue? Is wokeness, quote unquote, in niche higher education, women's studies, and so on? I mean, we're a world power. We spar on an annual basis with the Chinese, the great Gulf Arab states. Is the idea that feminist theorists are misquoting Marcuse, why is this something we should worry about, James?
If you understand how these disciplines operate, so this is actually at a superficial level, this is a trenchant criticism that deserves some commentary. So I don't want to dismiss it out of hand and say, oh, these people just don't understand anything. But the truth is, these people don't understand anything. They don't understand in particular what's going on. These departments are fringe. So the normie core out there and the kind of, I don't know, there's this kind of like academic, I don't know, it's almost like a guild of knights within academia who are like, oh, it's just like 1.8% of the academy does this or something. But when you start to pause and realize that this sector of the academy separating out
Good.
I may have dropped out there, so I paused. Is that okay? It's okay.
Yeah. You might want to just start back. Sort of this sector of the academy, it's labeled as about 2%, but you view it as problematic, and kind of go from there.
Try to close more tabs. Maybe that'll help. Okay, so virtually 100% of the people who graduate from these departments go into one of a very small number of professional tracks. They almost all become activists because that's what they create. It's on their websites that they're designed to create social activists. Virtually all of them go into administrative roles like human resources or employee training, or they create these diversity training things that employees in various workplaces are required to take, or they become lobbyists. So they very disproportionately go into relatively niche fields in terms of overall employment numbers that have an outsized impact on institutional policy. Now, I'm not talking necessarily about government policy. I'm talking about the policy that runs the actual institution, the codes of behavior and ethics that your workplace or your government agency or whatever it is going to have to abide by, the so-called community policies. They go into these positions in disproportionate numbers. So you have graduates who believe that the entirety of society is organized by these systems of power that make you rethink how you organize policy at every level. That's, of course, our friend Henry Rogers, Ibram Kendi's favorite little word, policy. You don't need that many people graduating who are activists who want to change policy if they are disproportionately going into the roles in huge disproportionate numbers that lead to creating administrative policy, mostly not through elected means, but through unaccountable means like being appointed or appointing themselves, or even getting just kind of, it's very frequently the case, for instance, in corporations. I hear from people who say that, we hired so-and-so, and then it's usually she just kind of appointed herself, in charge of figuring out the community guidelines for the company Slack channel. And so this person has now decided there's a workplace community, and she's going to be in charge of what the community guidelines are for that then dictate how anybody is allowed to work or to speak and interact in the workplace or around workplace relevant topics. And this is what happens. So it is an issue that's difficult to understand, that a very small proportion of people can have a very significant influence. But when they are disproportionately filling the roles that set that kind of policy, and again, we've set education aside entirely, because virtually all of our schools of education are teaching straight out of this stuff as the correct means to teach. Critical pedagogy is the standard in all of our education programs I think in North America right now. So you can have an actual hugely disproportionate impact. Again, we've also not talked about communications or media, where you train people up to frankly learn how to do critical hot takes, and then you stick them in some role at the New York Times and they publish this garbage that gets massive numbers of views because hot takes are something that goes viral on social media. And so the possibility for disproportionate influence is extremely high when you have people who are directly targeting policy and cultural production as activists with a very peculiar view of the world. There's a very peculiar shape. And again, I know I'm rambling and going on, but it's very important to understand that the shape of the critical theory is to be explicitly anti-liberal while mimicking the outward manifestations of liberalism, that, you know, we have to entertain all ideas. We want academic freedom, except when it's not the kind that we have. What are they saying? You know, critical race theory gets banned by this executive order Trump puts out, and they say, well, that violates academic freedom. But if you were to say, well, I want to bring a conservative to campus to speak, absolutely intolerable to safety. And so it's, you know, these kind of into a reimagining of the liberal system, but with power dynamics at the basis of it. And those are the power dynamics outlined by Marcuse and developed by Black feminists like Angela Davis, going into Kimberly Crenshaw, Angela Harris. We can name Patricia Collins. We can name the whole gamut, or queer theorists like Judith Butler.
Yeah.
Or people we want to name, just like Beatrice Spivak and characters here. Huge influence when that's the case. They look like something people you will sign off on. I had a friend today send me a thing where they've spoken to their school, and their school superintendent said, well, we're not into. And then they said, well, look at all this stuff on your website. This is critical race theory. This is critical race theory. This is critical race theory. And then the superintendent said, well, I don't really know what critical race theory is. But he was sure that it wasn't there. And so this is the kind of thing that makes it a very serious problem. I know that was a lot to take in at once, but this is unfortunately a complicated issue where to just say it straight without a lot of jibber jabber sounds a lot like you're a conspiracy theorist. But it's not that. You just have people creating activists who think in a particular way and sending them out into the world.
No, I think that is, just as a quick comment before Pete's question. Yeah, I think that's correct. That is the risk of wokeness. I think that what most political scientists would say is that the question remains to be seen how much control of certain elite discourses actually influences people. I'm not really criticizing your perspective or the response, but this is a conversation. I asked on Twitter the other day, do you believe that men who are charged with sex crime, biological males that are charged with sex crimes, who identify as transgender, should be sent to women's prisons, which is the consensus view of about 90% of the media? And 99% of people across males and females said no. So when I think of some of my friends, for example, one is a gentleman farmer, one's a captain in the military, one is a Black preacher. He's got 4 churches now, associated preachers with him. One's a CEO of a small company. I don't think any of those guys are on Twitter. So the question is, will this influence the population? But I think you're right. There are people that are trying damned hard that are in influential roles. I mean, I read the mass media, and it's definitely there. The New York, I assume you're familiar with the Great Awakening literature. The New York Times has used the word oppressive or privileged 8,000% more than they used to over the past 2 years. Pete, do you want to take over from this series of questions? What do you have to ask?
I can try. My wireless is so crazy. One of the things I know from my time in combat zones is the military tries to, when they're at their best, try to keep things simple. Shoot, move, communicate. You know, here's an objective. Take it. These are real simple things. When you start to bring in words like discursive and worrying about what somebody is or how they identify or what pronouns you use, you start to lose the ability to reliably get to the objective and get things done. You look at like this, I live in California. So you look at Gavin Newsom going to a party at the French Laundry, you know, and saying, hey, we're going to lose Thanksgiving this year. It's hard to lead when you can't reliably abide by your own rules, by your own things. If I can segregate somebody out into a different silo and minimize them based on power, someone's going to say enough and shoot someone in the face. I mean, that's because that violence, that kind, you talk about microaggressions. Let's talk about macroaggressions. How do we keep from escalating inexorably towards this division and get tribal? Because I've been to tribal places, man, it ain't fun. Is there any kind of way to get us off these rails?
That's a hard question. I don't know. I will say that the dynamic that you're describing is a thing. It is a real issue, and the dynamic that Will was just describing is also a thing. I don't know that these basically bourgeois, fake elite people are influencing everyday people's opinions all that much. In fact, I don't think they are. Most people I speak to who we might consider to be the people just call it by one simple word, is bullshit. What that does create, however, is a circumstance where you have a tremendous amount of distrust in the populace for its the people that are entrusted with power over that populace. And that is an unstable situation. That's not a good situation. And for what I've seen with these kinds of manipulations within the woke, if that's what we want to call it, is that it's particularly good at one thing and one thing only, which is making as many resources as possible and anything that it gets into be diverted into its own project. So its project might be, let's talk about race in a particular way all the time. And literally anything that's not doing that is going to be considered or treated as suspect. And this is going to, at the best case scenario for that, just becomes this drain on operational efficiency. It's also extremely fatiguing. It's extremely annoying. It's extremely tiring. So I don't know what happens, because my belief has been always that this thing is an unsustainable beast that will ultimately, in some sense, consume itself. And the question becomes, what does it take down with it? The other thing is that it's inherently polarizing. When you start diving into identity politics, and I want to be clear, I mean identity politics as defined by the Combahee River Collective in 1977. I do not mean what Martin Luther King was doing, which was politics that had something to do with identity, which is a very different thing. The difference is actually identity first politics would be a better way to put it, that we're going to put identity at the forefront of our politics rather than doing politics at the forefront of something that has something to do with identity. And that's a key difference. That's all throughout their literature, is they say that we have to put identity first. When you do that, you will reliably generate polarization because of a dynamic in sociology that's referred to as competitive victimhood, if nothing else. Also, people can just tell when they're getting kind of a raw deal or when they're being kind of blinded with bullshit, and it just polarizes. So how we get off that rail, I don't know. People used to say, oh, well, we need some huge external thing. Well, I certainly don't think a war could realign Americans around America, for example, because it would just polarize about which side of the thing is helping power dynamics. And I don't think even a volcano erupting or a huge natural disaster could. I used to joke that what Portland needs more than anything with all these riots is for Mount Hood to just blow up or something like that. And then they'll all focus on, dealing with a real problem instead of, LARPing in the streets. But then I realized, and I'm not exaggerating, that they would just call a volcano racist. And because the response to and the damage caused by the volcano would be disproportionate, therefore there must be power dynamics, therefore the volcanic eruption was racist. And it's like, oh my gosh, so a natural disaster, a war, these things are not likely to be able to realign us. I actually kind of suspected, but now I'm at the very forefront of the coming out of the election. But now I look at the situation and I'm like, nope, that one didn't work either. But I thought if there was kind of this apparently widespread belief, I guess Vox published a study saying, and Vox, I don't know how true it is, but a study saying that possibly as many as 66% of Americans doubt that our elections have integrity. Well, that's something that people in a democratic republic really should be able to rally around. But it still seems that we're just pointing fingers. And now it's racist to count these votes or not those votes. And it's all about Trump doing a coup, or maybe Biden stole the election. And so now it's like, I don't see that either. So I don't know what in the world it takes. I know that psychologically speaking, superordinate identities working together to achieve shared goals, these sorts of things tend to work. But I think we actually have a deeper level problem that has to be broken first, which is essentially that we almost have to start agreeing that people who are going to put the wrong things first, like making everything about identity on the forefront, are a major driver, whether that's people putting white identity first, which everybody kind of thinks is gross, whether it's putting male identity, whether it's putting female identity, whether it's putting black identity, whether it's putting, any identity. trans identity, whatever you want first, that those people are driving a problem that is centrifugal in nature, and is that itself kind of has to be looked at as, wait a minute, this is an issue. And there is some glimmer, some ray of light shining through after the election that we just had, that people are much more attuned and awake to that situation than before. I'm seeing an unprecedented number of people in what I would describe as the center left now saying, look, I think we needed Trump out. I think we needed to get rid of Orange Man. I think we needed to get country back on track. We needed to get back to normalcy, and enough of this woke crap too, which is the most hopeful thing that I've seen coming out of the election so far. Now, of course, the election's still technically not settled. And so who knows where that goes next, and how crazy, like Trump could do crazy stuff that drive everybody crazy. He could do totally legitimate stuff that makes everybody go crazier because nobody forgives anybody for being right when they don't like it. So I don't know. I don't want to black pill myself or others, but I don't know what the answer to depolarizing at this level is. I do know it's possible. The Civil War eventually depolarized some 30 years later. So that was a thing.
Yeah, actually, traditionally, depolarizing in large tribal armed societies has taken a war. If you look at the Yugoslavia, the USA, the Confederacy, I mean, a number of other examples, but that's not what we're going to do here this time, hopefully.
I don't know if we would. I think actually just the nature of the change in technology may prevent it. If we do end up going, a lot of people are wondering if we would go into a civil war, a second civil war. I genuinely do not think it would look like any war that any of us would imagine what a war looks like. I think it'll mostly be shit posting online, to be honest with you, and cyber attacks and screwing with people in that sense, maybe doxing them, occasional like outbursts of violence like we've seen all summer and into the fall throughout our cities from various groups that skirmish in the streets. But it'd also be very guerrilla in orientation, because we've entered into a different period in history. I think that the war wonks call it a fourth gen war or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, a primarily cyber-focused conflict. I mean, I'd say that's probably accurate. I mean, just looking at this and putting aside the political science of just analyzing the young men I know, I mean, the percentage of people on either the SJW or kind of alt-light side that have that traditional training with firearms and a knife and that are actually going to go live in the field for weeks at a time and dig ditches with entrenching tools and fight each other. I mean, that's a very small percentage of the population. Most of the people that have an interest in doing that are center-right and in the military, which is one of the remaining trusted institutions, which would obviously, you'd assume, disrupt any of that kind of violence. So in terms of politics short of war, you attracted some notoriety by saying openly online that you were going to vote for President Donald Trump, that you thought that obviously for all of his flaws, he was issuing formal executive orders targeting wokeness. He was going against this stuff, and that was a primary issue of yours. And I thought you expressed that pretty well. Now, it looks like Uncle Joe Biden is going to attain power at the end of this recount process and so on. And a lot of people that I'm friendly with on the left, Kathy Young and so on, although she might object to that label, essentially argued that people who opposed wokeness should vote for Biden because he would be a bulwark against it. I didn't see the logic of that argument, but what do you expect along CRT lines from a Joe Biden administration, a Biden-Harris administration, let's say?
I expect so CRT specifically, because woke is bigger than just critical race theory. There's also the gender ideology aspect of it for certain. And with his Equality Act that he said he would sign in the first 100 days, that's his own other thing. But within critical race theory specifically, certainly, I think it's a absolute likely or absolute certainty. I would give it 99 and I don't know, maybe quarter of infinity, 9% chance that he's going to overturn Trump's executive order that was banning certain aspects of critical race theory in certain manners from being taught in federal workplaces and contractors as so-called diversity training. So if you read the executive order, which apparently like 0% of the media have, section 10 explicitly says you can do diversity training, you can teach critical race theory in an academic fashion, but you may not teach it as uncontested fact. And if you do diversity training, you cannot use the divisive concepts listed in Section 2, which include things like openly discriminating by sex or race, scapegoating by sex or race, stereotyping by sex or race, teaching that the United States is inherently a racist or evil society. There's a number of other things. I think they list 9 tenets that are prohibited. And if you read through them, they would also by default ban patriarchy and white supremacy training if such things had any ability to get into such a place. So they were written in an even-handed way. It doesn't say thou shalt not do critical race theory whatsoever. That's very important. But he will definitely put this back in. So what we'll see is rampant mandatory training in critical race theory. And then the realization by the activists will be certainly that was not a guarantee in life. So they're going to ramp that up to a degree that was heretofore not really what was happening. So we're going to see a massive amount of that. Best case scenario with that is that nobody really pays any attention to it. It's just some annoying workplace training, and we just waste taxpayer dollars in large amounts on paying people who don't deserve it to teach that crap to people who don't want to hear it. Worst case scenario is that it sets up very divisive and hostile working environments that are likely to fracture and cave to activist demands. Secondly, I expect he will not tap very many woke people at the level of cabinet, but he will appoint a very large number of woke people who are a few levels down from cabinet where they get less scrutiny, and they will end up doing in the federal government very similarly to what has been happening under Inslee in Washington State, which is to create things like equity task forces and to ram as much CRT into administrative policy in different departments, whether that's the Department of Justice, the Department of Education, the Department of Labor and Commerce. I guess those are 2 different departments. Housing and Urban Development will be extremely heavy. The Department of Energy will be very heavy because his racial equity plan that he's listed all year on his website and has now transitioned to his Build Back Better transition website explicitly says that he has all of these racial equity plans to achieve racial equity in areas like housing, urban development, education, jobs, especially green jobs, and in banking and so on. So, and he's already started to tap people who are known critical race theory activists for these positions. I know that he's now appointed somebody, or is planning to appoint somebody to the Treasury Department who believes in full reparations, for example. And there's a number of other examples, where somebody for housing and urban development that's going to be, that's coming from Oregon, and her whole thing is culturally responsive everything, culturally aware everything. That's just critical race theory. So we're going to see critical race theory stuffed and rammed, depending on the situation, into administrative policy and educational policy at pretty much every single level of the departments. So, like I said, most of it will focus on equity. Most of it will focus on creating the most legally allowable discrimination program, positive discrimination programs, which by the partial, these things, I don't want to say that they're zero sum, because there's no guarantee that, if we're going to hire a person of one identity, then it has to be a job lost to a person of another identity in a one-to-one fashion, because you could actually hire, more people. But you will definitely see positive discrimination toward the groups that they deem are protected classes. You will definitely see, therefore, given that an incentive comes into play to start scrambling around that, you'll start to see that identity politicking become more and more relevant because the incentives are going to be put into place. So at the policy level, I don't think you're going to have, you're going to hear him yammer about systemic racism a lot and ending systemic racism a lot, but I don't think you're going to have him come out and just write an executive order that's just directly some critical race theory demand from Black Lives Matter. It's not out of the realm of possibility, to be honest with you, but mostly it will happen, I think, at the administrative level to install equity programs and equity agendas, which will in practice be largely racial quota hiring and money distribution programs at virtually every level. I'm also very worried about what after this summer, and Kamala Harris literally saying donate to the funds that are bailing people out of jail in these riots. I'm really worried about what biases will creep into their Justice Department as well, because the unrest of the summer can be, if we wanted to really draw back and say, well, what's one thing that could have been different that would have made a huge difference in the amount of unrest over the summer, which is a euphemism for riots and arson and just violence. It was if the district attorneys of these various municipalities had just done their job and charged the people who got brought in for obvious crimes, then it would have dampened the effects of this unrest a lot. So if we have a Justice Department that goes squishy on this stuff, we could have the same kinds of problems that plagued us this summer as kind of standard operating procedure, mostly in our cities, for as much as the next 4 years.
I'm curious, I kind of asked a doom and gloom question before, but I'm wondering, when you have an idea that can't stand up to rigor, which I think your guys' work in the academic publication sphere posed. We had Abigail Schreier on talking about, young girls transitioning to boys, and just like right now, you're being attacked in the YouTube thread right now. Like, people can't stand to even have a rigorous conversation, which means that the idea, which means the idea is, it hasn't been tested. If it's the best idea, it should be able to withstand rigor.
Right.
It starts to fall apart when you're like, wait, you're going to identify me for me and give me a platform and force me to be racist before I even get to look at my actions. Or, I've never taken a DNA test. I don't know what my ethnic makeup is, and what the hell would that matter anyhow? So we have all these flawed pieces to this. And then we have the Leviathan that is the United States government. And you can poke it with spears and all that it just kind of dumbs its way along and just goes in the direction that it's generally going. The president, is becoming more of a king, but are we worried about a bunch of nothing that's going to fall in on itself? Because look, when push and shove come together, I'll take hard dudes that do hard things over people that have never, likely been hungry, can't hold a conversation that's intelligent. I mean, is this as big of a problem as it seems right now, or will this go? And also, we have for the most part, a pretty good legal system that would deal with things like, when you openly say, hey, we did something because of the color of your skin, which they'll gladly say to you, you're like, hey, by the way, we're going to court to settle this. Will this sort itself out over time?
So I think, and I've written this repeatedly, and it's also, I'm usually not comfortable speaking for other people, but my co-author, Helen Pluckrose on Cynical Theories, also shares this view. We've spoken about it many times. She's written about it many times. It's in Cynical Theories. I think she actually holds it even more strongly than I do. But I do think, again, that this is going to collapse under its own weight. And the question isn't whether that is going to happen or not. It's what it's going to do in the meantime and what it's going to take down with it and it goes. Those are the relevant questions. This has the capacity to make life very unpleasant and very uncomfortable, depending on what happens in the meantime. It has the capacity to undermine the authority and institutions that we depend upon. It has the capacity to create policy that's dramatically unfair and very injurious to people. And it has the capacity to induce even more backlash and an even stronger backlash to it, which is its own problem. Not to say there should be backlash. That backlash is good, but it's virtually inevitable if you push it too far. And so the damage that it can do in the meantime is considerable. And that's without getting into anything extreme or very worrisome about what it could do if it had and started to abuse power, like where we saw people saying we need to make lists of people who voted for Trump and make sure they can, or people who supported Trump and enabled Trump, not voted. They were a little bit more careful than that. And we need to make lists of these people and make sure that they aren't able to find gainful employment again. This is some actual truly damaging stuff. If for no other reason than you are economically disenfranchising a significant part of the people of your country who were talented enough to have significant government jobs during this administration. At the same time, you say, oh, well, we'll take it to court. Well, let's assume that the court continues to work exactly as intended, and we hope it does, and we have decent reasons to think it will. That's just a waste of time and money. So we become less and less and less competitive as a nation by dumping our resources into these damaging projects, these frivolous pursuits. Like, for example, they even just, I put it on Twitter a day or two ago, and I apologize, I don't have the details. I get a river of information, and people will say it's like drinking out of a fire hose. No, it's like drinking Niagara Falls, what comes my way. And so I saw this thing where they themselves, people who are into the diversity programs, they're teaching the diversity training, said, it's really weird. Our diversity trainings are not having the results we thought they would. In other words, what everybody's been saying all along is they don't work. So we're spending millions of dollars and spending millions of man hours, demoralizing man hours, creating workplaces that many people report are uncomfortable and hostile and unpleasant. We're having people leave their jobs that are qualified and competent people because it sucks to have to deal with this stuff every day, to do something that doesn't work. This is snake oil. So this is just, if you think about it in terms of like operating efficiency of our nation or our GDP, we now have this gigantic drag happening. That's all in the meantime. And then there's the problem, like, I don't know what it would take at this point, given some of the things that the ACLU has stood up and defended in the past year for woke stuff, what it would take for a significant portion of the country to ever put any faith in the ACLU again. How does it recover its reputation? I'm not saying it's impossible. It's certainly possible. But when you start losing faith in institutions, that faith in institutions is like trust in a person. It's very, very difficult to earn somebody's trust properly. And it can fall down with a single bad event or even a single misinterpreted thing. And so getting the trust back in these institutions that seem to have betrayed people on their core reason for existence is not something that comes back easily. And again, that's a loss of efficiency, but it's also just going to be collapse. So just like COVID forced us to close down businesses that are not going to be able to gather the capital to restart, the same kind of social capital and political capital that goes into institutions, and also material capital for businesses that waste too many of the resources on this stuff and crack internally, that is stuff that just gets lost and has to be rebuilt. Just the issue of police retiring in massive numbers is extremely concerning, because those people, and I know that the YouTube comments are going to go berserk, but guess what? This is reality, and you're just going to have to deal with it. Those people possess something that is formally called institutional knowledge. The thing that institutional knowledge is that the book tells you, hey, here's the book, rookie. This is how you deal with something. Now, come here. This is how you really deal with it. This is how you really do policing. And everybody's going to say, that's where the racism is. No, it turns out that life is messy and complicated, and things like police work are not straightforward or simple. And so there's like the official book, and then there's the kind of unofficial book that is a place where corruption and racism and other problems could be present or creep in. But at the same time, they're also where effective policing in the practice. So if you take out, just say, 20% of the most experienced cops, they're like, I'm out, I retire. And then you say, well, we still need cops, which isn't even clear that that's what's going to happen. And you say, let's bring in 20% new. I guess you have to change the proportions, I guess 25% new, so that the numbers work out, because that's how fractions work. I'm a mathematician, I have to be responsible. And we replace the numbers exactly. You're bringing in rookies who don't have institutional knowledge, and you've lost people who do have institutional knowledge, on the job experience. And this is going to happen across every sector. And that's, again, a massive loss, without even having to talk about things that are actually likely to collapse, in the fact that we, as Peter Boghossian likes to phrase it, we have a severe legitimation crisis happening right now. And that legitimation crisis is going to, again, require resources, time, effort, and so on to fix, if it can be fixed. I know that in my lifetime, I'm very like the bar that the New York Times would have to cross to earn my trust back right now is so high. And it's going to be that way for so many people. And if it's CNN, and you can start naming these media companies that, and you can say, oh, well, what about Fox? Yeah, I don't have any trust for them either. I lost my trust for them in like 2007 and it never came back. So it's like, This isn't a partisan issue. It's a legitimation issue that if you lose your trust in our institutions and our media and our government, and that trust is hard to earn back, and it's all a waste.
Yeah, I know a number of people that are in senior levels of a variety of services, whether it's the Secret Service, on White House details. And these senior folks are desperate to get out and get away from it, because, they see what's coming. And I mean, imagine being a DC Park, and I know DC Park police people and how challenging their job is. They go out and they defend your right to free speech and to peaceably assemble, and they get spit in the face and access to COVID for it. And you see the numbers of people that are injured on a police force. It's not sustainable just from these things. And then also the sense that you can train these uber efficient, hyper professional police officers when people don't even want the job right now. To have a blue belt be a requirement to get a job it's not realistic. Who wants to go spend their time and money getting beat up in a dojo to go into Oakland and try to deal with I mean, you're a mathematician. Imagine that decision tree, the Euler map for being a cop in Oakland. Oh, and by the way, you don't get paid that much. You have to be a blue belt. You have to have it's just not, that is also, like, to your point with the resources, that's not sustainable.
Yeah, pretty much nothing about this thing, because it's so detached from reality and it's so focused on a particular pay attention to the realities or the contingencies of the inputs. It's just so unrealistic that very much of it is. I think that this may be one of the single most griftable programs that human beings have ever mainlined into their society, because it's all based on lived experience.
That actually ties into, sorry if it all busted in. That ties into sort of a two-part input-output question I have. First of all, what do you think is the relationship between wokeness and, frankly, relaxed collegiate admission standards? I mean, legacy programs on the one hand, institutional affirmative action on the other, massive. There are quite a few of these programs, by the way. I don't think most people outside higher education are fully familiar with this. The range of athletic scholarships, in-state preferences, minority preferences, the integration of more women perhaps into STEM, legacy programs if you've ever given more than 2,000 to the campus. But at any rate, focus on legacies and affirmative action. What's the impact between letting in a third of the students on a campus with reduced standards and this sort of thing? I mean, are most of the people in, for example, a post-colonial studies major, people that were admitted under kind of these relaxed metrics that are going to go through sort of an alternate college experience and then come out as an activist rather than an engineer? Have you looked into that? What's your thought on that question?
I haven't looked at the statistics, so I can't say a lot about what proportions of students and who they are and where they're coming from. I can say that from my own personal experience and teaching myself to be research level in this stuff in 4 months, that it's not particularly hard. So it's not, I think Brett Weinstein phrased it that these departments are not by and large being filled by people who can do engineering. Because
I'd say that's probably correct. I mean, if you're looking at kind of an input-output logic model, I haven't researched this either, but I think one of the questions a lot of people in academia would have is, we've done 4 or 5 major relaxations of the standards, perhaps most notably affirmative action. You've got kids coming in, and many of these people are not necessarily going to become astrophysicists. In fact, there's an entire book, Mismatch, which frankly argues that many of the people admitted to the lower Ivies should instead go to a perfectly solid school like Central Michigan and actually get that degree. But you have people entering, failing out of perhaps traditional programs, and then finding refuge in this stuff. I think you just added another level to this, which is the idea that when you leave now with a degree in post-colonial studies, you might not be a barista. You might go into a company that consults with businesses on how to be more post-colonial. So you have this entire cycle of people that are not necessarily at any point judged by the normal standards of most fields. I mean, I guess the only real question there is, do you think that's what's going on? And if so, how do you stop it? How do you say, this actually is the question, how would the private sector respond to this on the output side in terms of people coming in and saying, well, I'm a consultant, I have this degree from Harvard, in light of the model we just broke down, what should business do?
We don't hire those people. Sorry. Best of luck to you. Frankly, that's what it is. That we've looked into these avenues of diversity training, and we found that they're not productive. They tend to create liabilities and risks for our workplaces that are predictable. And as your own literature outlines, they tend not to actually produce the results that you're selling. So we're not interested. I'm sorry. And that closes down part of that money wheel, because a lot of people are like, ha ha ha, you majored in gender studies, you're going to pour coffee. And that's not true. These are some of the most lucrative jobs. Look at what's happening in basically almost every job circuit right now, especially academia. You have COVID has put financial pressures on entities and organizations and institutions that have not been seen in a very long time. And yet somehow they're able to hire in universities. Every college in the universe seems to have hired a new diversity dean or suite of them at something like 4 times the average faculty member salary. It's like there's no money for, I mean, I don't know how many emails I've received this summer and this fall from people saying our company is furloughing employees or laying off employees, or we have hiring freezes, or we have this, or we have that, except for the, X million dollars we dumped into diversity. So this is actually an extraordinarily lucrative industry right now. This is, and to finish, by the way, the thought that I had before is it's not just going to be like dropouts from engineering programs that become the kids who come to school as hopped up activists that got worked up on this stuff in high school want to major in these things. So when you hear the administrators say, oh, it's student driven, that's partly true. They've been hopped up on this stuff by whether it's the social milieu that they're in or whether it's their high schools. This is true on both ends.
I like that you use the word milieu, and I want credit for bringing Euler into a conversation. That man's been dead for 400
You can have that
years.
for sure.
And as a mathematician,
yeah, Euler. But no, this is a very lucrative industry right now. There is a ton of money in it.
Yeah.
This is also a very artificial industry, which means that it is a bubble that's probably going to pop at some point, and that's going to be its own economic problem coming down the pike. Not even to mention the fact that we have been incentivizing massive numbers of kids to get degrees that are only worthwhile in a moral panic. And once the moral panic ends, they're basically worthless degrees. What job do they get then? That's when they get dumped into barista land, when the moral panic ends and everybody realizes. So the big picture answer to the question you're asking, Will, is that the incentive structures are all wrong right now. And if you want to change that, the incentives have to be realigned. Right now, diversity is hot, hot, hot. So everybody's hiring diversity. But the second that stops, the second corporations start realizing that it creates a risk portfolio and it provides very little value. In fact, almost no value other than some artificial metric that business people use amongst themselves right now to rate how effective their business is and maybe some weird stakeholder plan. Once that changes, we're in for a world of hurt. So the difference is, or the pertinent question is, how do you start shaping the incentives? Just like I mentioned earlier in the conversation about in academia, if you want to clean up these departments, you have to change the incentives. There's literally no incentives to puncture gender studies within the academy. And there's high disincentives because you're going to get called a sexist. You're going to probably called a racist, even though it's gender studies. You're going to get called all kinds of things. You're going to get told by your department head that you're wasting your time and you need to focus on something more productive if you even have time to do it. The incentives in all these cases have been artificially skewed to what Wesley Yang calls a successor ideology. And it basically, until those incentives move, we're stuck.
I guess my advice is if you can learn to join metal or fit pipes together, you will always make money. Even people hate you. They will let you fix their building or their other things.
That's true.
Always go to the trades and avoid all this stuff, I suppose.
I mean, that's definitely true. At the end of the day, being able to do the thing makes a difference. And people, I hear it all the time from people, even people who are woke-ish, I guess. I don't talk to many actual woke people outright, but the thing that I hear from them is, I don't care who fixes my car. I just want them to know how to fix my car. I don't care who my cardiologist is. I just want them to know what to do with my heart. So when it comes down to the outcome actually mattering, all of this kind of superficial diversity, bourgeois nonsense kind of falls to the side. It can be seen through. People will always have to do carpentry, will always have to join metal, will always have to fix pipes, always have to install heat and air, all of it, for a very long time anyway. And maybe not always. Maybe the robot revolution will get there eventually. But for now, those kinds of things are real. And I think that's going to create its own set of implicit incentives. And the bourgeois class very, very rarely in history realizes that it's like a big ball tottering on the top of a stick. And it only takes a little bit for it to fall over and crumble. But I think we're getting close to that point where it's likely to be tipped over and broken on the ground.
Will, you have anything to close?
I apologize for the sun. I mean, I know I can't control the sun, but I could, I guess, buy a curtain. It's killing me.
No, you're fine on my end. I mean, unless Will has anything, I appreciate the hell out of you coming on. Will, what do you have?
I have one final question, and I think all of us have had some minor Wi-Fi issues and so on. I can't stop the sun, but I can buy a curtain sounds like one of those great business flashcard metaphors, by the way. One thing I will say, and I'd actually be interested in talking about this with both of you guys a week or two down the road, but I think there's a market for anti-diversity training. I've been approached by corporations with some fairly solid retainers. Can you bring in other PhDs and talk about the issues with these models? I think that might be something that really comes up, having made a fair amount of money in business, frankly, over the next couple of years. So I guess the question that I was asked by 5 or 6 people on Twitter, really broad range, from a black feminist buddy of mine to a guy in the Army. When you're talking with people that are espousing these crit theory ideas going beyond just race, but I mean, all of society is set up to oppress black women or whatever. The real issue is the class struggle. How do you respond? I mean, my response, which I'm fairly well known for, is just sort of quoting empirical data. The total number of unarmed black men killed last year by the police was 14. But people will very often respond to that with pure logos, like my uncle is not a number sort of thing. Mm-hmm. How would you recommend that if someone is going full critical in Twitter, Instagram comments, how would you respond to that?
I find that in practice, it's extremely difficult. I don't feel, kind of like your experience, I don't feel like they're typically coming at this from a position that is deeply reasoned. And I'm not saying that to put anybody down, but I'm saying that because reason doesn't support the ideology. Reason and evidence themselves are in fact heavily criticized by the ideology. So that's probably not where the people are coming from. My experience has been that arguing back or discussing or responding tends to be quite unproductive. But asking questions and allowing them to talk and kind of go on a bit about how it's supposed to work and why does it work that way, and is that the best way to analyze it? Could there be other ways to analyze it? Do you recognize that other people might see it differently? What do you think of those people? If you just kind of continually ask these kinds of questions, you can either learn a lot about what they think and why they think it, or you can actually end up getting them to feel a little bit uncomfortable with the things that they were very strident about coming after you with. It turns out that, things are a lot more complicated than these narratives portray. And asking questions that help people realize that there's more complexity there, or that there is definitely a biased standard. Or, for example, okay, you could say we accept that there is something to this argument that there are systemic differences between identity groups. I don't know if that's true or not, but we can say that there's something to the argument. Fine. From that starting place, how much credence should we give it? Like, on a scale of 1 to 100%, like, how influential is that on any individual's life? And the second you can start making them pin themselves to numbers and think about it in that terms, in particular with the individual at the center, okay, so systemic racism is a thing. Fine, you say that. How, on a scale of 1 to 100, how much determination does that have on any individual's life? How do you explain somebody like Michael Jordan? How do you explain somebody like Barack Obama? How do you explain somebody like Oprah Winfrey? When you start naming some of these celebrities, well, there are exceptions to the rule. Well, does that imply that the individuals actually can escape? So we can now agree that it can't be a 100% determination on their lives. And if it's fewer than 100%, then you can start asking questions like, well, where is it? Is it 80? Well, why isn't it 90? And see if they can walk down to 70. Because at the end of the day, I think I could be content with some argument that ascribes some small percentage of influence. I had this conversation very specifically about gender hiring in physics with a physics professor at one point. And he said that they had this program adopted from the University of Michigan, and that it recognized, among other things, as an example that he gave me, that if you look on average in physics, that women have 1/2 the number of first authorships on papers, on academic published papers, as compared to men. Okay, that's a true statement about the world, I presume, that the number really, the proportion really is half. I don't have any reason to dispute that number. Okay, and I just said, well, what proportion of that is down to discrimination? He said, I don't know. I said, is there anything other than discrimination that you can think of? And he named a few different things that I guess he said it could possibly be that, right? And then I said, okay, so, here's a couple more. Do you think they could be those? He's like, I guess, no, but kinda. And so we had this sort of discussion like this where he's finding other places. And I said, well, what does the policy say to do about this 2-to-1? And he said, well, it's simple, because half as many papers have first authorships by women. We double the number of first author papers. We create a score that doubles the number of first author papers a woman has. So if a man applies and he has 7 first authors, he gets a score of 7. And if a woman applies and she has 6 first authors, and we give her a score of 12. And I was like, but you just said that you don't know that it's all down to discrimination. And I would agree with you that this might be a reasonable policy if it is down to discrimination, to adjust for things. And I think that's a fair conversation to have. But you just said you don't know that it's all down to discrimination. And then that's where I hit the brain worm. And he just yelled at me, like literally. And he said, what else could it be?
Well, I mean,
he just named 5 examples of things himself that it could be.
Just offhand is, a multivariate quantitative guy. Slightly less aggression about pursuing publications, more focus on classroom teaching, greater family responsibilities, far more non-traditional students among women. The one time I looked at this, there are literally dozens of possible explanations. I'm sure you thought of most of these yourself. And this is before even getting into the whole hereditary and culturalist debate is versus men, women, so on down the line. Every serious academic paper, thinking back to recent, NAS or politics journals pieces, every serious paper I've submitted, at least the majority of them, were anonymous. Right. So, J. Reilly. I can't imagine that there's someone there looking through the first initials and trying to figure out who might be female. Is the last name Steinmetz? What are the grad students named? So very often there seems to be no empirical defense for this at all. Sorry to burst in, but you'd have to debunk the aggression explanation or trained aggression. You'd have to debunk greater family responsibilities. I think the big one would be non-traditional status. I don't give genetics that much of a role, but there's a significant debate among male females versus the different races where that effect would be much smaller. If it existed at all. So, but you'd have to get through all that and then say society is racist and evil. You can't open with society is racist and evil. Now prove me wrong. You need to hire me, although I have fewer publications. That seems almost a nonsensical reverse of what the case probably is. Unless I'm does physics have a non-blinded submission process or something?
No, not that I'm aware of. And the point you're making is correct.
Yeah. It is.
And most importantly, the point that you're making that they start with the conclusion and reverse the hierarchy or reverse the standard of proof is correct. If we can track back to the fake papers that my colleagues and I wrote, we can track back to virtually everything I've read in their literature. They start with their conclusion that the society, and I can quote them and say, yes, this is exactly what, say, Critical Race Theory, an introduction, which is, I think, a fairly authoritative book on critical race theory, seeing as it's a standard textbook in the field. This is what they say, is they say that, and in fact, if you don't like that one, we can switch to like 10 others. They all say racism is the ordinary state of affairs in society. Something being not racist would be the aberration from that ordinary state of affairs. So they start with that assumption and then basically twist the epicycles until they can figure out where the racism is hidden or the sexism in the case as it may be. And so this is not a form of rigorous analysis. And while I was unable to persuade this physicist himself, because I hit the brain worm, and that's what happens when you hit it, which is, it's not a nice way to put it, but it's a visceral way. The true way is to say that I used to hit it with religious people a lot. Because I had these religious people who were pretty liberal in their faith, and I could have very kind of penetrating conversations about religion from a non-believer's perspective. And then I would hit a certain spot that was too sacred, and they would it was hitting the brainworm. They flip out, and all of a sudden it's like, we can't be friends anymore because you asked the question they hit too close to home, and that happens. And that means that there's an article of faith that's tied up with one's sense of oneself as a moral individual that's ultimately at the bottom of what's going on. And so when you ask, how do you interrupt that? How do you have that conversation? Well, now we're operating at what the Harvard Negotiation Project describes as an identity level conversation. And those are extraordinarily hard, painstaking conversations to draw up. Why is it that you require believing in this in order to feel like a good person? Why would it make you feel like a bad person if you stopped believing in this or believed otherwise? And those conversations are very difficult. They're probably going to be one-on-one kind of conversations. They're certainly not going to resolve in public conversations. They're only going to happen in private where people can sit back and think. And for your average person out there, though, the best thing you can possibly do to respond to stuff like that is try to find a way to get them to laugh at themselves gently. I still think that we should praise the civil rights heroes of the 1960s for all of the work that they did in ending institutional racism in the United States. But if you want to ask me what really ended racism as a kind of a bigger cultural phenomenon in the U.S., Richard Pryor, Chris Rock, all of these guys, these comedians, did way more. And I actually, frankly, think that comedy done well is critical theory done right. But this is an unpopular opinion that's its own unpacking to do. So I think that getting somebody to laugh at themselves gently for holding absurd views is ultimately an agenda that we should be having. But good Lord, I mean, when you're up against somebody's sense of being a good person, it's almost impossible.
Yeah, I think just there.
Yeah, man.
Yeah, just as a very quick final note, I mean, I would say that is accurate. I mean, the great taboo of critical theory is in general the suggestion that disparities aren't due to discrimination. I mean, so not only, hereditarian models of performance, but also culturalist ones, where people make the very obvious point that American whites or middle-class blacks certainly study less than Asian Americans. And that's why this group is so remarkably successful. If the native-born groups, African Americans, working-class whites, don't studied as much as Asian Americans, you'd see dramatic increases in performance. This is absolutely undisputed by any teacher or coach I've ever met. But even this produces this anger and sort of this nonsense, like, well, why don't Americans study more? At least for the black guys, is it racism? And there's no real proof that there's a substantial amount of racism in the modern academy, certainly, or that racism has increased since the 50s when Americans did in general study more, so on. It's just the default. If you are claiming that this gap is not due to discrimination, you must be claiming it's due to something deep, permanent. You must be a bigot. Even in the case of culturalism, where that makes no sense whatsoever, where you're literally just saying, pick up the book. That is the default. And Ibram Kendi has spelled this out.
Yeah, Forrest Kendi has thrown this out so many times. Oh my gosh.
And it really, again, when I said, I think a lot of this relates to, frankly, lowered college admissions to some extent. I mean, if you take people who are potentially very successful, high potential individuals, very often looking at affirmative action or even legacy programs, but put them in environments where they're 180 points behind the average curve, which is a lower end estimate, they are going to underperform, one, and since they've succeeded throughout much of their life, wonder why they're underperforming, two. The book Mismatch is good on this. And this stuff seems to me to provide a pre-made explanation because they're bigots, because they're racist. So Kendi's idea is you can attribute any gap either to one, just straight up racism, he just says racism, or two, to deep set problems with the group that's currently failing. And this is just a definition of some kind of genetic weakness. The reality is, in fact, there are very many cultural and situational variables that predict about 95% of this. I mean, the average black man is years younger than the average white man. African Americans are more likely to live in the South. But anyway, I don't need to start reciting Thomas Sowell books. There's no evidence for this really at all, in my opinion. I just wanted to see if you had seen some, perhaps, something like that.
No, I've seen none. I've seen absolutely none. But what you said about Ibram Kendi is so exactly right, where he sets you up into these kind of false dichotomies where, either you accept that it's racism or you must be saying something is wrong with black people. That's like one of his favorite go-to lines. And it's so frustrating as anybody who's got any responsible view of anything to say, no, there are other options here, Dr. Kendi. So I have not seen anything specifically that suggests that. I mean, frankly, I don't even think I don't think systemic racism even exists. To be honest with you, I think it's a made up concept to say those discrepancies and outcomes that we don't know how to explain can be attributed to this thing that we call systemic racism. In other words, where equity is not, systemic racism must be. So I see no, if that was the question you asked me. Now, if you're asking actually if I've seen anything to suggest that letting people into college who've never had any business going to college, and I'm not talking about anybody by race, because I used to teach a lot of people who definitely didn't have any business being in college that were the same race I was, or am, I guess. I don't think it changed.
I didn't want to assume your race.
No, I mean, I don't assume
Didn't
my
want to
race
assume
either.
what race you identified with.
Yeah, I mean, well, I'm hiding from the sun like a vampire, so let's go with race vampire. But no, the thing is,
differently alive community has rights. Damn it.
that's right. Differently alive. No, but the thing is, truly, there have been a few major errors that I think the university systems have made. One is letting a lot more students in than should have been, and another is focusing relentlessly. And I hear this from college professors all the time in the department meetings. Relentless focus on student retention. I actually, it's part of why I was not keen to stay in academia in 2010 when I left, but 2007 and 8 and 9, the last 3 years I was teaching, it was just relentless that, let's make sure that nobody gets too low of a grade in their service level math class. And it's like, these kids can't add fractions. It's like, it doesn't matter. We got to keep them in school and keep them happy. And that's a thing. When you add in the dynamic that you have people who've always done well, and you need to just write a book, Will. You're on this.
This may be my next book. Actually, I'm probably gonna talk with John McWhorter, who I know, and just make sure we're not treading on each other's toes. But I'm interested in the exact parallels between a lot of modern movements, with woke as the most prominent of them, and the religions they replaced. I mean, in terms of the idea of martyrs, holy places, prophets, taboos, things you just can't say. I believe it was Intelligence, but one of the major journals just announced they wouldn't publish any research that indicates genes might have any role in shaping group level intelligence. And I mean, it seems like you're not just talking about blacks and whites, you're talking about isolated regional populations and so on. I tend to be very, very culturalist on IQ, looking at charter schools and so on. That still struck me as ridiculous that my opponents couldn't publish.
Right.
So the idea of utter tabooing, this is the tapui on this part of the mountain, you can't go here. Even the idea of utopia down the road, the promised land, or what would original sin be? I suppose maybe whiteness or enjoying this society.
Yeah,
Redemption would be fighting that in yourself, fighting privilege and appropriation. But I mean, I think that would be the next book. And I would definitely throw in some of this, like why people come to the faith. I think we do have a lot of rice bowl Christians who need an explanation for things like academic struggles. This is the one. Have
you read my stuff about that, by the way?
I'm sorry?
I've got a couple of essays about wokeness, particularly as a religion. I don't know if you've read them.
I've not read them, no.
They're long. Together, the two of them are just short of 50,000 words. So they're almost a book themselves. So I've given a lot of thought to that issue. There's something there. I mean, I can tell you where the parallels are. I think I know where their God is. I think that's important, actually, that their God is the eye at the end of history that judges whether or not you are on the right side of history or not.
I think
sort of like
I'd certainly love to read, the essays from a colleague, check them out. I mean, I think that they're more focused on a devil than a God. I mean, to me, the original sin of wokeness is sort of social participation with blinkered eyes or something like that. If the idea of racism, in Dr. Kendi's terms, is any system that produces unequal outcomes, the ultimate woke reality, the revelation, is that everything is racist and sexist. It's hard to think of a single system, from the tax code to the NBA draft in June, that doesn't produce results that differ dramatically by race, sex, age, so on, LGBT versus straight, if you're looking at marriage rates. So all of society is flawed. If you're looking in religious terms, this is Midgard, this is purgatory, this is the world away from the light, underworld serpent. And you need to redeem yourself by unpacking each of these systems and changing it. And there are these prophets there to help you do this. Now, again, I personally think that without at all disrespecting your work, I mean, I think it's solid stuff, but I think maybe about 5% of upper class kids are aware of this stuff. This is the one check I would put on the new faith. I mean, its demographics more resemble Scientology than, the African Methodist Episcopal Church. When I play basketball or golf with like my black buddies in a large southern capital city, if I were to say the word cisgender, at least 3 people would stop and say, what are you talking about? Pass the ball. I mean, it's not something that necessarily a lot of people are aware of outside of that online media discursive bubble. But that media online discursive bubble, I don't mock, because it determines what most other people are going to be seeing in a year or 2 or 3, the way top tier fashion design does. So.
Right. Yeah. I fully agree with that for sure. There's also a huge split that I don't really know how to characterize yet. The everyman versus versus this, I don't know, media tier, if you want to call it that. I've referred to them now as just the bourgeois. After having read up on, the precursors of the French Revolution, I was like, oh, I know these people. Okay. Like I've been trying to get their attention for years. I forget them. So this is a thing. And it's, again, like I said earlier in the conversation, the risk for me, when I said that I was going to vote for Trump, for example, my argument was that Biden's irrelevant. And in fact, if, somebody texted me earlier and said that everybody in Ohio is scared now because Lord Biden's coming. And I thought that was pretty funny. But I actually have been referring to him as Biden the irrelevant, because it's not him, but his administrative state under him. It's what that class of people is able to do to influence people who set policy that becomes the problem. And I'm less, we'll see what happens with the House and Senate, but I'm less worried about legislative policy, which is scary enough, but I'm much more worried about this administrative level policy that just kind of like quietly screws your life up. So you would never have to know what cisgender is at all to know that if you don't put your pronouns on something, that you're going to have a hard time getting a job.
Well, that I think is the thing, though. I think we all agree on the influence of this among the urban lower upper class. And since that's where many people, including all 3 of us on occasion, although with annoyance, find themselves, yes, that it's absolutely relevant. I think that the question, if you're applying for a job, thinking again to the same group of guys I hoop and golf with, the latest guy to be out of work apply for a job, he was a fireman. Now he's a lead at a steel plant, essentially. I don't think anyone in that entire process for the awarding of that $90,000 job would ever ask him what his pronouns were. There's a great scene about this in the movie Office Space where the Peter character says, like, does anyone ever come up to you and say, guess I got a case of the Mondays? And the guy who's like a construction worker is like, man, you get your ass kicked on the job site. You said some damn fool thing like that. And he goes back to drinking beer and like talking on the phone with his wife. I think that I don't know how deep this could penetrate into a lot of American society. Tom Sowell pointed out very famously in The Vision of the Anointed, for example, that we keep seeing these crusading groups at the top, the hippies, and then, the replacement, the young Reagan, Dinesh D'Souza type young Turks, the yuppies. And then this goes on and on and on. It's very cyclical in the dating scene in big cities. But I don't know how deep that penetrates. It penetrates into society when you start seeing some of the things that, for example, 1619 is trying to do, like change the school books that are used nationally. I do think that's when it becomes a little more relevant. But that's when they're going to encounter something they don't even know exists, which is the other power bases in the country. That total unity among every regional Catholic church that you see if you ever do real charitable work. Like, they will wake up much more powerful dragons if they start taking this stuff into the provincial capitals like Louisville. I do think that's 100% true. But again, why waste all that time and money?
Yeah.
I would love to grab a bag of money, and because I've got a couple peer review papers under my belt, not as good as you guys, but getting there. And I would love to go to a place like the Congo or Malaysia and do some research and see if I can prove Kendi right in another laboratory. And I'm just going to guess that whatever he says is not going to work in a place that is, complex like the Congo. And
how would you prove Kendi wrong by taking a bag of money to the Democratic Republic of the Congo and walking around with it?
Yeah. Well, you got to have a way to live. I'll take my bet. I'll take me and Kendi. We'll go out and do the work. We'll see who comes back with more stuff and comes back alive. Well, I don't want to keep you too long. I know you got stuff to do. Thanks so much for coming on. I mean, it's such a great conversation to have. We can't fear rigor. We have to have these conversations so we can deal with what's real. And then when push and shove get together, just go weld something. Go work. If you're worried about these things, just keep working. Because while these guys are worried about who's racist and who's not, you're going to be outperforming. You know, it's like that whole Kamala Harris rope down the mountain thing. Just take 2 steps to the right. There's another rope there. You know, go meet somebody else. And they're like, I have a whole bunch of rope. I wish someone would climb it. It's just a bunch of nonsense. If we just keep working on being together and working hard on getting where we're going, a lot of these things are going to sort themselves out. I mean, that's at least I hope. And if not, well, then we'll look like the Congo at some point.
Yeah, or South Africa with nicer buildings. And I had a political scientist friend the other day tell me that his guess, the long run on this, is that we will end up with, you know, the polarization problem is that we're going to end up with this very point scoring divided, I guess, politics like you see that's just dysfunctional but not particularly evil throughout much of South America. He says that we're, in his opinion, on an unstoppable ride in that direction unless something can massively reset our party structure and the polarization around it. And I don't know, maybe he's right.
Well, South Africa is a political scientist. South Africa is what happens when you respond lazily to certain pressures like demographic differences. They have Blanco y Mestizo y Mulatto populations in South Africa. The thing that defined America was that for a long time we responded non-lazily. So, I mean, diverse societies actually have something of an advantage, going back to the Roman Empire, the modern EU as a whole, even Brazil, if they have a very strong civic nationalist identity that links everyone. That's the essential prerequisite. Mm-hmm. So I prefer diversity given that. Diversity is a negative without that. So right now we seem to be, in one sentence, because I talk at length, we seem, because of a weird form of guilt, to be abandoning our successful civic nationalist training. So, I mean, the old American ideal was, you know, let's have a session, work out the problems, get things done. I mean, that's very much the idea of managing diversity, even, or total quality, anything we did in business. Now what you see is, well, let's have a session, work out the problems. The first thing you're going to hear is, what about a women's session? And then that becomes, what about a black women's session? And the last couple of times I've done anything corporate, into a black gay women's session. And at this point, you're really just generating 90 different proposals that are going to produce more of a fight. So will we return to our old sense of identity? We easily could. I mean, you saw something like, 40% of Hispanics voted for Trump. I mean, these aren't racial divides in the USA. But let's hope someone comes along that is able to unify people, that's able to say we need to stick together and not sound like a racist. And then there's hope.
We've got Lord Biden, though. So hopefully we'll see how that goes.
Yeah, I mean, I'm personally betting in the markets that there'll be a President Harris within 2 years. I mean, no disrespect to Uncle Joe, but I mean, the man's 78. So I actually think that's when you might see more woke stuff.
What's the betting market on that? What's the over/under on the Harris presidency takeover? What's the number? There must be one.
I mean, it's the majority of the betting odds are on the side of Harris taking over within 2 to 3 years. Like, it's, most people don't think Joe's going to make it 4 years. I'd have to look at Bodog or something, the exact odds, but I mean, there's a good chance of a President Harris. And then I do think you get into some deeper questions, like, does the president gets to pick their VP nom, right? So who would we wind up with? Would it be, say, President Harris and Vice President Warren to make a, powerful cross-racial statement about feminism or something like that? Because then there is the possibility for some things you wouldn't see under Uncle Joe. So conservatives are in the odd position of hoping Biden stays alive and healthy.
All right, man, I'm going to let you go. Thank you so much for coming on. Come back. Let's do this again. And Will, thanks for setting this up. You did all the heavy lifting. I mostly just have bad Wi-Fi. So I appreciate you guys today.
Yeah, gentlemen, for sure. Hit me up. I'm happy to do it. It was a good conversation.
I may hit both of you guys up online about anti-wokeness consulting. Might bring in Coleman Hughes, too. There's gold in them thar hills.
Let's get it. Let's get it.